It was a chilly Thursday morning in Washington, D.C., and the federal courthouse buzzed with the kind of tension you could cut with a knife. Reporters from every major outlet huddled outside, their breaths visible in the air, waiting for the high-profile corruption hearing that had ignited national interest. At the center of it all stood United States Attorney General Pam Bondi, a seasoned legal warrior who had never backed down from a fight. Across the courtroom sat Judge Terrence Mallory, a man known for his arrogance, theatrics, and decades-long tenure on the bench. He held power like a king swinging a scepter, and his rulings often tilted the scales of justice, but not in favor of the people. What most of the public didn't know, yet, was that Bondi had been quietly compiling evidence on Judge Mallory for months. Allegations of bribery, hidden assets, and political favors had bubbled beneath the surface, and now, it was finally time to drag them into the light. Bondi was there to challenge a key suppression ruling that Mallory had issued in a major fraud case involving one of his longtime associates. Her voice was steady, clear, and resolute as she began her oral argument. But as she laid out the inconsistencies and the unusual speed of the dismissal, Mallory leaned forward with a condescending smirk. "Well, Miss Bondi," he interrupted loudly, "I'm sure you've had your hands full spinning conspiracy theories for your new boss, the president. But in this courtroom, we deal with facts, not Fox News fanfiction." The courtroom fell silent. The insult wasn't just unprofessional. It was a direct jab at both Bondi and the sitting president, Donald J. Trump. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even some of the reporters lowered their cameras in shock. Bondi, to her credit, didn't flinch. She stood calmly, eyes locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she said slowly, "with all due respect, the facts I'm presenting today are not fanfiction. They are supported by federal records, bank transactions, and sworn testimony. And if this court won't address them properly, I assure you, America will." Mallory waved her off with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. "Save the grandstanding for the campaign trail," he scoffed. But behind Bondi's steel gaze was something far more powerful than campaign bravado evidence. The kind that made even the most powerful men sweat as she gathered her papers and walked away from the bench. She didn't smile. She didn't have to, because just 4 minutes later, the wheels of justice would turn in a way Judge Mallory never saw coming. As Attorney General Pam Bondi exited the courtroom with quiet dignity. Her legal team remained behind, exchanging glances that said everything without a word. She didn't need to make a scene. She had already pulled the pin on the grenade. Exactly 4 minutes after Mallory's biting remark, a young U.S. Marshal entered the courtroom from a side door, briskly walking up to the clerk's desk. He handed over a sealed document marked "Emergency Motion, Immediate Review," and whispered something to the judge's law clerk. Within seconds, murmurs began to spread as court staff huddled behind the bench, their faces suddenly tense. Judge Mallory furrowed his brow and leaned back in his chair, clearly annoyed. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The law clerk whispered again, this time louder. "Sir, it's from the Chief Justice of the D.C. Circuit. It's urgent. You're instructed to recess immediately and review the attached files in chambers." That never happened. Ever? A judge being ordered to recess by a higher court mid-session? That was legal thunder. Something that only happened when something big was about to drop. Mallory hesitated, then glanced toward the gallery full of cameras and journalists. His smug expression faltered for a brief moment. He banged his gavel. "Court is in recess," he muttered, before storming off into his chambers. What he found there changed everything. Waiting on his desk was a thick dossier stamped "Confidential," compiled by the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility. Bondi hadn't come to court that morning to argue a mere motion. No, that had only been the bait. Inside the dossier were bank records tracing back over 12 years, showing offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, wire transfers from shell corporations linked to Eastern European oligarchs, and real estate acquisitions in 3 different states purchased under pseudonyms, all connected to Mallory. There were also testimonies from former clerks, defense attorneys, and even a federal whistleblower. Bondi's office had already filed for a judicial misconduct emergency hearing, set to begin that afternoon. As the judge read through the documents, a cold sweat began to form at his temples. There were photos, one in particular that made his stomach drop. It was of him at a private dinner in the Bahamas with Viktor Zavarov, a sanctioned Russian billionaire whose ties to global money laundering were well documented. Bondi had been methodical, patient, deadly precise. She knew that Mallory had surrounded himself with power and privilege for too long. And now, the walls were closing in. That very moment, outside the courthouse, reporters began receiving encrypted leaks via email. A press release from the DOJ, already pre-written and timed for the second the motion was filed, outlined the Attorney General's findings and the immediate investigation into judicial corruption at the highest levels. Social media exploded. Pam Bondi strikes back. One tweet read, "Judge Mallory under federal investigation," screamed another. Cable news anchors scrambled to interrupt their scheduled programming. The nation was now watching. Inside the chambers, Judge Mallory gripped the edge of his desk. The insult he had thrown at Pam Bondi had not just backfired. It had detonated years of secrets in one single morning, and it was only just beginning. By the time Judge Terrence Mallory emerged from his chambers an hour later, his skin had gone pale, and his usual arrogance was nowhere to be found. He returned to the bench, but his hands trembled as he gripped the gavel. No statement was made. No explanation offered. He simply recessed court for the remainder of the day, citing unexpected administrative obligations. But the damage was already done. Outside the courthouse, Attorney General Pam Bondi stood before a wall of cameras, her expression stoic but her message thunderous. "This morning, I stood in a courtroom and was insulted not just as an attorney, not just as a woman, but as a representative of the American people. Judge Mallory mocked the pursuit of truth, but justice doesn't bend to arrogance. It bends to facts, and the facts are now undeniable." The press erupted with questions, but Bondi didn't stay long. She had more work to do. Back inside the DOJ, Bondi's team activated Phase 2. The corruption network that surrounded Mallory wasn't limited to a few suspicious bank accounts. It stretched deep into Washington's legal and financial elite. Attorneys who had consistently won high-stakes cases before Mallory's court were now being investigated. Political donors who had mysteriously received favorable rulings were quietly being subpoenaed. The most damning thread? A secret PAC, Liberty Integrity Now, that Mallory had allegedly used to funnel bribes through fake campaign donations. The PAC had raised over $9.2 million in 3 years, with no public accountability and no spending records. Bondi's forensic auditors had traced the funds straight to luxury condos, hidden land deeds, and a $2.1 million yacht currently docked off the Florida coast under a shell company. Within 24 hours, 2 of Mallory's former law clerks voluntarily came forward, turning over encrypted drives and internal memos. They claimed the judge had ordered them to scrub conflicting case details and ghostwrite decisions in favor of certain preferred parties. One clerk even had a recorded phone call, Mallory demanding she fix a ruling before it was released, saying, "I don't care if it's legal. Make it look legal." The phone call went viral. CNN, Fox News, Newsmax, and MSNBC all ran wall-to-wall coverage, each offering their own spin, but all agreeing on one thing. Pam Bondi had just cracked open one of the biggest judicial scandals in American history. By the end of the second day, the DOJ filed a formal judicial ethics complaint and requested Mallory's immediate removal from the bench. A bipartisan group of senators publicly endorsed Bondi's motion, citing the mountain of evidence as deeply disturbing and disqualifying. Even President Trump weighed in during a press briefing. Pam Bondi is a national treasure. What she did today, taking down corruption right in the heart of our justice system, that's real leadership. I couldn't be prouder. Meanwhile, Mallory hunkered down in his D.C. townhouse, his legal team scrambling to craft a narrative. But no statement could fix what was already unraveling. His name had become synonymous with corruption. Protesters gathered outside his home. Judicial panels convened emergency meetings. And most hauntingly of all, Bondi wasn't done. Because the deeper they dug into Mallory's empire, the more they discovered just how many powerful people had benefited from his decisions. They were next. As the hours ticked by, the noose around Judge Terrence Mallory's empire grew tighter. Each minute brought another revelation, another thread pulled that led to more rot. But what made this takedown uniquely devastating wasn't just the scale of corruption. It was how coordinated Pam Bondi's strike had been. This was no lucky stumble across scandal. Bondi had engineered the collapse like a military operation. For over 6 months, a covert unit within the Department of Justice, handpicked by Bondi herself, had worked quietly to uncover every brick in Mallory's foundation. Former IRS agents, cybersecurity analysts, and veteran prosecutors had met in off-site buildings with no windows, combing through years of financial trails and sealed records. And they found everything. One by one, the dominoes fell. A real estate developer in Miami, long suspected of illegal land grabs, was arrested by the FBI after they traced a pattern of rulings from Mallory that allowed him to avoid zoning restrictions in exchange for offshore deposits. Then came the bombshell email leak that a whistleblower from within Mallory's former campaign team handed over more than 2,000 emails, revealing direct communications between the judge and major law firms. One exchange showed Mallory promising a favorable ruling in a class action suit before the trial had even begun. So long as my friends receive appropriate consideration for their endorsements. The legal world went into free fall. Law firms raced to issue statements, distancing themselves from Mallory. Judges who had shared panels with him suddenly requested transfers. Even defense attorneys who once boasted about his leniency on white-collar crime went quiet, as internal audits began in law schools, bar associations, and judicial councils. The story was now global. Headlines around the world painted the picture. America's judicial scandal rocks Washington. Attorney General Pam Bondi leads the charge, and yet, Bondi never took a victory lap. She refused late-night talk show invites and turned down magazine interviews. She was focused, unshaken, and deeply aware of what was still to come. Because corruption on this scale doesn't just exist in isolation, it's protected. That became clear when Bondi's team received an anonymous tip. A former federal prosecutor, fired abruptly years earlier, claimed she had been silenced after beginning an inquiry into Mallory's connections to a private intelligence firm with ties to defense contracts. The firm, Black Stratus Intelligence Corp., had won millions in secretive government deals, all signed off by judges, including Mallory. The contracts were padded, over budget, and some were completely fictitious. Mallory had provided legal cover for the firm to operate in legal gray zones while funneling kickbacks to a network of co-conspirators. And there, in the fine print of a 2017 contract, was a name no one expected: Congressman Richard Halperin, chairman of the Judiciary Oversight Committee and one of Mallory's longtime allies. Bondi realized what she'd uncovered was no longer just about a rogue judge. It was a deep state-style pipeline connecting judicial authority to corrupt political influence and financial gain. As subpoenas were drafted, phones tapped, and assets frozen, Halperin held an emergency press conference, looking visibly shaken. But instead of denying the allegations, he made a quiet, trembling confession. "I made a mistake, one I regret deeply, but I am prepared to cooperate fully." That was the crack that broke the dam. Other officials began cooperating, racing to get ahead of the tidal wave. A retired district attorney, a former Treasury official, even a sitting federal appellate judge, all linked back to Mallory's courtroom. Pam Bondi's quiet, calculated strike had become a full-blown purge of corruption at the highest levels. But there was still one final move left on the board. It was a crisp Friday morning when Judge Terrence Mallory, once the untouchable titan of Washington's judicial elite, was led into a federal courtroom in handcuffs. The same courtroom where, just days earlier, he had belittled and insulted Attorney General Pam Bondi, in front of a packed gallery. Now, the tables had turned. He wore a crumpled gray suit. His normally well-groomed silver hair hung limp, and the look in his eyes was no longer one of superiority, but of defeat. U.S. Marshals flanked him as he approached the defendant's table. The irony? Mallory wasn't here for just one count of corruption. He faced 19 separate charges ranging from bribery and obstruction of justice to racketeering and conspiracy against the United States government. Pam Bondi sat just feet away, calm and resolute. And this time, she had the full weight of the American people behind her. As the indictment was read aloud, Mallory closed his eyes. Each word seemed to chip away at the last fragments of the empire he'd spent decades building on backroom deals, bribes, and arrogance. When the judge asked for his plea, Mallory, ever the showman, paused. "I plead not guilty," he said, forcing confidence into a voice that barely held together. But no one believed it. Outside, crowds gathered holding signs that read, "No justice above the law. Bondi 2028. Corruption ends here." Over 11 million Americans had tuned in to watch the live stream of the indictment, making it one of the most watched federal arraignments in history. Over the next 3 weeks, the Department of Justice released a sweeping report dubbed the Mallory Files. The findings were explosive. Mallory had directed favorable rulings in over 43 high-profile corporate cases in exchange for under-the-table consulting fees, used shell companies to hide more than $14.8 million in real estate, foreign investments, and luxury assets, signed off on sweetheart deals that had protected 2 major pharmaceutical companies during the height of America's opioid crisis, companies whose board members had donated to the same secret PAC uncovered by Bondi. But perhaps the most shocking revelation, a handwritten letter, found in a locked drawer inside Mallory's personal study. It was addressed to a sitting Supreme Court Justice, in it. Mallory detailed a vision to reshape the judicial landscape, a new era where rulings serve the powerful and the willing. It was signed with a single phrase, "The bench belongs to us now." The justice immediately disavowed any involvement and pledged full cooperation with federal investigators. But the letter served as a chilling reminder of just how far Mallory's corruption had reached, and just how close the American system had come to collapse from within. 6 months later, Judge Terrence Mallory was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 47 years in federal prison, forfeited all personal assets, and was disbarred for life. But the fallout didn't stop there. 3 federal judges, 2 lobbyists, and a former senator were indicted in what became the largest judicial corruption case in modern American history. Several Fortune 500 companies saw their executives resign, and a congressional ethics review was launched that reshaped the political landscape heading into the next election. As for Pam Bondi, she remained grounded. In an interview with Brett Baer, she said, "This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about reminding Americans that no one, not even a judge, is above the law." Her approval rating soared. Civil liberty groups across the spectrum praised her courage, and whispers began across party lines about a potential 2028 presidential in a country often divided. Bondi's dismantling of a corrupt empire had united millions in a simple belief: justice still matters.